Just because you found somebody who's equally unhealthy and willing to stay in an unhealthy space with you doesn't mean that these things aren't happening.
Welcome to the Team LogoFit Roundtable. I'm your host, Laurin Conlon. Each week, we cover the evidence-based practices and communication-driven strategies we use with our clients to help you look, feel, and perform your best. And today's episode is with our mental health consultant, Rick.
Hi.
And we're going to be covering two personality disorders, or two of the most common personality disorders. Asterisk, one of them is commonly known as a personality disorder, but is more of a mood disorder, right? So borderline personality disorder as well as bipolar disorder. And we had a lot of really great feedback from the Narcissist podcast, which falls into these kind of categories. So I wanted to do another round where we cover these in depth so people have some background and also go through like some case studies and just really to understand it. Because I feel like, and we talked about this a little bit before, like anxiety and depression, like while they're not, I don't want to say they're really easily understood, I feel like they're talked about a lot. And I feel like these aren't, and there's definitely reasons why, based on some of the criteria, how you said, with like a lot of people are coming in maybe because of the people, right? Not necessarily like the individuals themselves. But I just feel like there's not as much talk about these two, but they're still very prevalent. So it's important to talk about, even though they're maybe misdiagnosed or just misunderstood.
Well, it's interesting that you use the words anxiety and depression, because what you're going to see when we're talking about these diagnoses, these personality disorders, mood disorders, etc., is that there's elements of depression and elements of anxiety that are in them. And so a lot of times when people are talking about other individuals, or they're talking about life experiences, like sometimes we're circling around or we're actually talking about a mental health diagnosis that they just don't know even exists. It's just what they recognize is the anxiety, they recognize the depression, they recognize these other elements to it. And what I think made the narcissist, go ahead, what were you going to say?
Why do you think that they're diagnosed that way instead of like just getting labeled as anxiety or depression and maybe not these other ones? Is it like easier to diagnose? Is it easier to treat? Or like, I know that there's sometimes...
These are, to me, these are more complicated to understand versus somebody who's like experiencing anxiety. It's like, okay, we recognize the signs and symptoms of anxiety. We're pretty good on what depression looks like, so we recognize those things. It's the other layers that are added to it that can help conceptualize a client as being more borderline or somebody with more bipolar or somebody who's narcissistic or whatever it is. You need the context. Like one of the case studies that I'm going to share with you is a result of 3 months worth of treatment of me talking to somebody where I'm like, I clearly have a good understanding of this client, their history, their patterns, their behaviors. I know what they are now, so or what they're like struggling with.
An initial misdiagnosis, but then it might get changed or not?
Yeah, these are two of the most commonly misdiagnosed because of the complexity with them and some of the layering that has to be involved in order to really understand it. Because it's not like you can just... And sometimes people will do that. They'll get a gut feeling, like when you work with somebody, a particular population for a while, you're like, you can throw them into a category right away, and you're like, but then sometimes that's detrimental because you have to work your way out of that mentality because you're like, I need to see this person as an individual, not as just a type. So, yeah.
That makes sense. I just wasn't sure if they were being misdiagnosed for the whole course of their treatment, or if it was just kind of like an initial misdiagnosis, or...
It can be. I mean, I've had people who have been treated for, like when we're going to talk about bipolar personality, right, or bipolar disorder, one of the defining characteristics of it is major depressive episode. So people will present with the depression aspect of it and miss everything else that comes along with it, because when you go to a doctor, you're talking about the presenting symptoms that you have right here, right now. And a lot of times, if you're going to see a psychiatrist and not necessarily a therapist,
15 minutes.
You're going to get your 10 to 15 minutes, and they're going to be like, well, tell me what's wrong. You're going to be like, I feel depressed, lonely, I have low energy, fatigue, I don't feel like getting out of bed. They're like, okay, cool, depression. Well, wait a minute, there's a whole bunch of other stuff here. You did no psychological assessments. You don't have an accurate idea of their history or what else they've been struggling with or how long they've been having this. They may come in and be like, oh yeah, for the last month or so, I felt a little... low energy, I'm not sleeping very well. And so in their mind, they're like, oh, well, are you allergic to any medications? No, well, let's start you off on a low antidepressant. And it's like, and off we go. right? We didn't get any idea of their relationship history, their upbringing, their perspectives, their views on the world, themselves, their own issues that are creating this.
So frustrating. I feel bad because I feel like there's probably a lot of psychiatrists who don't want to be like that, but it's just like they probably get so overbooked.
If they don't want to be like that, then the responsibility falls on them to change it. One of the biggest issues that I have is there's a lot of what we call like by history. So I'll get a client that'll come in and I'll see a diagnosis, right? It'll say ADHD by history. And so what does that mean? It means at some point, somewhere in this person's life, who knows how early, they were diagnosed, let's say age 11 or 12 with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. All right. Well, now the person's 19. They've been carrying this disorder with them and this diagnosis with them for years. And I can see through their records that they've seen multiple therapists or multiple psychiatrists, and no one has changed the diagnosis. Even though, as I'm sitting there listening to this person and I'm giving them a 60-question assessment to complete, they're able to focus, pay attention to the task, follow directions, include the details of it. They're able to carry on conversations. They're not fidgeting. They're not doing anything. It's like, well, you're looking at this person going like, okay, I'm not seeing any initial signs of attention deficit, right? So then let's put them into the program. Well, now they're in the program and 3-4 weeks go by, a month goes by. And it's like, is this kid on medication or is this person on medication? No. Why are we still treating them for ADHD, right? Has anybody actually taken a look at the diagnosis and measured it against the criteria and put it against multiple settings in this person's life? How are they doing in school? How are they doing in their social life? How are they doing in all these other areas? And they're not meeting the criteria anymore. They don't actually have it. Like sometimes it's a maturity thing. There's a lot of other factors that come along with it. But I see a lot of times the psychiatrists don't want to change somebody else's work. Mm-hmm. And so they just pass them along. They pass the diagnosis along. Now the benefit of me, especially when I see a client in the treatment programs, is I have them for a minimum of a year. So it's like, okay, I have a pretty good understanding of where this client is. I may not change it initially, but after I see them and they start making their way through it, by the time their discharge starts coming up, I will change the diagnosis. And I'll have ample support to justify that. That's the problem to me with some of the more modern day psychiatry is they're just not spending time with patients in the way that is truly beneficial. They're just addressing symptomology rather than how are we getting at some of the more root causes and what can we do to actually enhance this person's life other than just medication.
Yeah, no, it's definitely frustrating. I'm sure part of it is obviously insurance and part of it is there's a lot of nuances, I'm sure. But it's definitely
even in my practice,
suboptimal.
Yeah, it isn't, and it's...
You can't do anything really in 15 minutes. I mean, you can do something, but you're really not going to get a lot done. I mean, even in an hour, you can obviously come to some sort of conclusion or have some positive feedback or impact, but like 15 minutes is going to be... Right,
and how are you taking what you're learning and expanding it to the rest of your life? You can come in for an hour, all you want, every week, and you're going to accomplish some things. But if you're not taking that information and moving forward with it, then you're basically just getting that 1 hour. Instead of the strategies to implement it in your relationships. What are you doing when you go home? What are you doing while you're at work? What are you doing while you're in society? And this is like, depending on what your problems are, there's a lot of different things that you can be doing. And I think to me, that's also one of the frustrating parts is I see somebody coming in and they're like, hey, I'm struggling with this. And it's like, okay, I'm going to give you these things to work on. And I don't see you for 3 months. And I say, well, how are you doing with those things? Well, I didn't do any of the things that you told me to. And it's like, okay.
Okay, well, this isn't going to work.
Well, then they're like, so what are we going to do? I'm going to be like, the same 3 things I told you to do last time. And then they're like, well, that sucks. And I'm like, well, we have to do it. Sooner or later, you have to do these things in order to see.
Or at least try them, and if they don't work, then you can make adjustments. But it's not.
And I tell people all the time, like, all right, do these things, and it'll work. If it doesn't work, you can come back and call me a liar. And no one's come back to call me a liar yet.
So confident. All right, whatever disorder that is, you have. So let's go to borderline.
Well, when they do them, they're like, oh, I get the results. It's like, if I want bigger arms, I've got to go to the gym and lift weights. Like, if you do that, you believe that?
Oh my God.
I know.
No way.
Yeah, no way.
Okay, borderline.
Can I kick you under this table?
Yeah.
All right. Borderline.
You're going to fuck up the camera, so don't do it.
Borderline personality disorder. So what is borderline personality disorder? It is basically an instability that exists in relationships. It's an instability of their interpersonal relationships. It's an instability in how they see themselves, their self-image, their affect, and it usually has a lot of impulsive behaviors that are attached to it. Borderline personalities oftentimes have intense emotions, and they rapidly will shift through those emotions, and they're mostly negative emotions. They're not necessarily like positive, happy-go-lucky emotions. They're more or less anger, sadness, things like that, feelings of loneliness and emptiness. Those are oftentimes what they're cycling through. And it's more based off of like an emotional dysregulation that is more about your perception of the world and how you're perceiving events, right? So
it's not really what happened, not like an event. It's just kind of
how you
general.
interpret that event is critical, because it's your perception of it that's causing you to be guarded and defensive and to manifest these other signs and symptoms of whatever the disorder is. And so what I also want you to know is oftentimes borderlines will have extreme responses that don't necessarily match in proportion to whatever the triggering event is. And this is also a good indicator to understanding the differences between borderline personality and bipolar disorder. Is that with bipolar disorder, it's more you struggle to regulate your emotions and there's no triggering event as a result of it. So you just like might wake up one day and you're sad and you don't know why. There's no event that triggered it, you just are sad. Same thing, you might wake up and be really happy for no reason. Like nothing in your life is significantly different, but you're just extremely happy. So that's talking about more the manic and the depressive episodes that go along with it. But for right now, we're talking about borderline personalities. And with borderline personality, you can oftentimes see a triggering event that results in the person feeling this way or reacting this way. So what does that actually look like? Well, first and foremost, by borderline personalities, God, this is such a confusing one to talk about all the time. Borderline personality.
Like BPD, and the other one is...
They're both BPD.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, wait.
We'll wait till we get to bipolar and we have BPD1, BPD2.
Great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Buckle up, everybody. We're going to stumble over those words.
So what does it actually look like? And for most cases, it's coming from this deep-rooted place where there's either a real or imagined fear of abandonment from other people. And so when they fear this abandonment, it creates a lot of these other reactions. So when the person perceives whoever that person is, their caregiver, their lover, their spouse, whomever, as potentially leaving them, even if it's not true, they think it is, you're oftentimes going to see these other reactions as a result of their perception of that event. So first and foremost, that person who is always kind of afraid of people leaving them or of being abandoned and alone and rejected, this is kind of at the root cause of this personality disorder. Next one, there's a significant pattern of unstable relationships, especially their interpersonal relationships. So what does that look like? It's a idealization of a person. At the same time, we devalue the person, right? So there's no in between. This is an example of a personality disorder that exists on extremes, right? There's very little middle ground because middle ground is stable. Extremes are unstable, right? And so when we're talking about that instability, what we see is this person will really value them initially, right? And they're like, oh my God, you've got to talk to this person. They're great, they're amazing, they're wonderful. And then very quickly they will switch to they're an asshole, they don't know what they're talking about, they're stupid. And so there's like, wait a minute, like a week ago or 2 weeks ago, this was the greatest person since sliced bread. And now you don't want anything to do with them. And now that you don't want anything to do with them, like you're actively putting them down, you're lowering their status. And so imagine being in a relationship with that person where 1 minute you're great and then the next minute you're like, you're confusing. Off. You don't know whether you're,
and then you don't know where you stand.
Exactly. Which makes
you're like, wait,
then,
what are you saying to other people about me?
Which what it does is it also starts to sabotage the relationship and make it all about that person. Because now my feelings, I don't have room in this relationship for my feelings. I have to react to what you are. And so I might be walking in going like, is she going to be happy or sad today? Is she going to be angry with me? Like, what did I do? Like, and so when you start having those questions and you start having this inner dialogue with yourself, like these are signs that you might have somebody in your life who's struggling with this. There's identity disturbance, so an unstable self-image or a perception of who they are as an individual.
As in, like, they perceive it to be different than other people?
They perceive themselves to be good, bad, right? Oftentimes they might perceive themselves to be somebody who's almost like non-existent. So there's an instability in how they see themselves. They know
their actions don't really matter because they don't.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, yeah, but they're just inconsistent with how they see themselves. Like one minute they can see themselves as really somebody who's really great and awesome, and the next minute they can be like, I don't really exist in this world. So there's an there's an instability within how they see themselves, and that sense of self. There's also a lot of impulsivity that comes with this disorder. What does impulsivity look like? Spending sprees, unprotected sex with random strangers, or substance use, reckless driving, engaging in binge eating.
I'm going to say this sounds like somebody who would probably fall into like drug abuse probably pretty easily.
Very much.
Should like try to regulate it possibly.
Now, suicidal behaviors don't fall into this particular category. There's a separate category just for suicidal behaviors. But basically, it's any type of behavior that has a negative or detrimental experience to the person. And it's highly impulsive. They're not thinking through it. They're just reacting. So they're not weighing the consequences of their decisions. They're not focusing on long-term pros and cons. They're just reacting. And oftentimes this is met with a cycle of guilt and shame afterward, which reinforce feelings of emptiness and loneliness and worthlessness. And it gets to this really vicious cycle. So the next one would be oftentimes with borderlines, we do see suicidal or parasuicidal gestures, cutting, scratching, attempts to commit suicide, suicidal threats, things like that. So it can also be forms of abusive relationships. Domestic violence can fall into these categories. An instability in their own mood is another category. Chronic feelings of emptiness is pretty typical. And last one would be an inappropriate, intense anger, difficulty controlling their emotions, their temper. They're prone to temper tantrums, which again follow the same pattern of I got really angry, I said some stuff, I did a lot of things, I broke stuff. I feel bad about it afterwards, intense feelings of guilt and emptiness, and all of this reinforces I'm bad. And when they're in these cycles, then what you tend to see too is they idealize the person that they were arguing with, they're fighting with, and they're so sorry, and they're begging for their forgiveness. And so there's just this constant push-pull in the relationship that exists because it's operating on these extremes. And anybody else who's in their life has a really difficult time matching it. And if you can envision this, it's also very difficult for that person to feel comfortable with who they are because they're always on these extremes, which is why they turn to substances, and there's a volatility in their relationships, and they go through relationships all the time.
I mean, yeah, who could stay in I guess if it's really, are there like, most personality disorders obviously are on like a spectrum, but is this something that people see, like even with bipolar, like there can be tendencies toward it, but maybe not like huge, like you can swings.
You could have people
this
who,
like a
you could have people who might have, like for a diagnosis, you would need 5 or more of those symptoms, right? However, a person might present with 2 or 3, and you're like, okay, you might not necessarily be a diagnosable borderline personality. However, you certainly have traits that are detrimental to relationships, your ability to work and function in society in a healthy capacity. So we definitely want to address that. And so what you'll also see with this personality type is they often idealize potential lovers. It's kind of the love at first sight. What you'll see them do is they demand lots of attention very quickly. And they oftentimes will share too much information too soon. Like you're giving too much intimate information really early on, like earlier than it should be. You should get to know somebody before you start disclosing certain things. So we see that a lot. Again, they switch from idealizing a person to devaluing them. For 2 weeks, this person might be blowing up your phone all the time. They want this attention from you. And then they go like the complete opposite direction. There's a great book out there. I always screw up the title of it. It's called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. And so it really talks about borderlines and that push-pull where it's like, I can't stand you, I hate you, but please don't leave me because I'm afraid of abandonment. And it's this creation of how they perceive themselves and the world around them, and these have developed into their coping mechanisms for their life. And so when I've talked about in the past where I say mental health disorders are coming from a place of where we're creating them and from early childhood experiences, to me, borderline personality fits that criteria as a result traditionally of early childhood trauma.
And neglect, it sounds like.
Yes. And depending on what that person lived through, it shapes this. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a case study to help you see, like, okay, well, these were the symptoms that Rick said. What does it actually look like in a client? How does it manifest so that I know what this actually looks like?
Is this something that typically is like incapacitating for people who like are pretty severe? Like they can't really hold down like jobs and like obviously they have issues with relationships, but is it like everything that's affected or it's like just...
Some people, yes.
But
other people can be like CEOs of a company. And it's that impulsivity sometimes that it can be intoxicating to certain people, right? Because they're like, oh, they're so spontaneous and they're like, they just take these risks. And it's like, sometimes those risks have a really great reward. But it's like, when you find out that it wasn't a calculated risk and they just like bankrolled everything on a impulsive decision, it's like, it wasn't clear. It worked out, which then can be detrimental because it reinforces the impulsivity with positive rewards. But yeah, no, sometimes it can be people who like will keep very remedial jobs. They struggle with maintaining employment. They struggle with keeping friends. Their family doesn't like being around them a lot because there's a toxicity that comes with this.
I guess I ask because there's sometimes I feel like when we talk about stuff like this, not just us, but in general, like it can seem really like the way that we use terms like anxiety, right? Like the research is clear on like very, very severe types of anxiety and like how that affects, you know, like new moms and like all people, right? Like, and I feel like people will hear certain, how am I trying to phrase this? I don't want people to hear this and be like, oh, I have that. Maybe I have borderline personality disorder. Like, whereas like you might have traits of it, but like, I'm just trying to, I guess, gauge the like severity of like, is it like incapacitating or is it like, oh, you might just be influenced. Like you might not be able to have like long-term relationships. Because, does that make sense?
Yeah, you can. I mean, this is the hard part. Borderlines can be in relationships that last a significant period of time, a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. But oftentimes, these patterns, even though the relationship has existed, it doesn't mean that these patterns haven't been existing in them. Just because you found somebody who's equally unhealthy and willing to stay in an unhealthy space with you, doesn't mean that these things aren't happening. Most of the time, what we see is if a borderline attaches to a secure attachment style, right, or they enter a relationship, it doesn't last very long. Because the person who's more secure, who's grounded and lives in the middle is like, this is too fucking chaotic for me. I can't, like, it just starts to make them physically ill and they're like, I have to leave this. And so this is countertransference occurs a lot with borderline personalities and therapists. This is a particular disorder that I work a lot with because of what I do. I work in prison systems, so I'm dealing with people who are coming from severely neglected, abandoned, traumatized backgrounds. And so when we see this personality type come in, like my spidey senses kind of go off and I'm like, you know, and then it's a check for me to be like, okay, I need to make sure that I'm not treating this person because I know some therapists who flat out, like it's on their intake form. So have you ever been diagnosed or has anybody ever told you you're borderline? And if you check that box, yes, they're like, next. They're like, I don't want you. You're going to have to go down the street to see somebody else because they don't want to deal with it because it's that consuming and the rate of change isn't that great. And so it becomes difficult. And so the people suffer with this. It's difficult to find quality treatment for borderlines. There's a specific modality that the therapist should be well trained and versed in. When I say DBT, that's dialectal behavioral therapy. That is a treatment created by Marsha Linehan that is specific for borderline personalities. And so if you are struggling with this, you need a therapist who is trained in this. And I don't mean took some fucking CEU class and has a diploma on their wall. I mean somebody who is a trained, certified DBT therapist. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. So let that person help guide you through this because there's a really different way of starting to reprocess yourself and the world and how those things work to help you make better decisions throughout your life. So a lot of times these people will destroy good relationships, especially when they know it has the potential for being something long-term. They'll immediately abandon it. So there's that, but it's weird because like the rejection isn't coming from the other person, it's actually coming from them. But the way they perceive it in their minds is that they're still alone. They can be supportive or cruel. You know, meaning they can be really helpful in certain moments or punitive in others. This goes along with that perception of how they see themselves as either good or evil. So these shifts can occur where, like with somebody that they care about, they can be really nurturing and supportive, financially giving them a lot of money, things like that. And then in the next minute, their perception, if they believe this person is about to reject them or abandon them, can turn very punitive. It's like, I'm going to crush them. I'm going to deny them everything. Like, it's just the reactions that they have, and it's very extreme.
So extreme.
Yeah. Again, viewing themselves as bad or evil, and then their self-destructive acts can oftentimes, and the reality is these are a result of their perception of being rejected or abandoned. So the impulsivity that you see, the anger, the temper tantrums, all of these things are usually secondary to the idea that the person has perceived somebody significant in their life leaving them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's kind of the criteria for what borderlines are. I'm going
I
to
think
give
the
you...
case study will help, because I think this is definitely one where it's just not maybe as it's not talked about as much as maybe some other personality disorders, and I think it just, I don't know, I think it just leaves a lot of questions, because it is kind of like one of these like,
Sure.
how do we,
what does it look like?
Yeah, what does it look like in practice? Because there's a lot of things that like make sense, but like, what does this look like in a person?
Okay, so this is a client of mine. So this person, so let me read through kind of quickly the diagnostic criteria, and then see if you can match it up as we move through. I'm not going to make you do it.
I'm like, hey, we're just going to stop right now if that's what we're doing. So.
No, I couldn't get you to pick a number once. I'm not going to have you do this on 1 through 10, everybody. That was Lauren's task. Anyway, we've talked about that in the past.
It's in the past.
It's in the past.
I'll always leave it there. Stop bringing it up.
All right, so
trauma.
Number 1, expectations that the person that expectations is that another person in their life will meet their needs, right, and won't abandon them, won't reject them. They have a devaluing of the person, meaning that the person doesn't care, doesn't like me, I'm not enough, they're never there for me, right? That's a very common thing. Either supportive or punitively cruel. Self-destructive behaviors, self-destructiveness like angry disruptions, difficulty maintaining close relationships, chronic feelings of emptiness, difficulty controlling their temper, again, chronic feelings of emptiness and loneliness, anger, things like that, right? That's kind of the broad scope. So here's the client history. This is a particular client who lost her sister at an earlier age. Sister was often referred to as a mother type figure, right? So what do we start to see there? Maybe a potential abandonment, right? Sister dying, it was involuntary, but it's still an abandonment. That person lost the one person who was supposed to be caring for them.
Yeah, and then obviously that means the mom wasn't caring for her.
Right. So there's, yes, exactly. And then she starts to go on, and these are some of the things that I wrote.
Got it.
I wrote this stuff as I was writing it in a session. Like when I do sessions with people, oftentimes I take notes. And so I'll start to write my notes out, and I'll highlight certain things, and then I'll put them all on a piece of paper to see if it makes sense to me. And so this was kind of my note-taking process for this particular client. And again, this is over several sessions. This is a while. So she had the loss of her sister, and she used to say, "Mom put Dad through hell." That starts to indicate to me relationship instability. There was just a long history of domestic violence, fears, anxiety. Mom would always tell her, "I don't like you," right? So this is also trauma. When we talk about negative perception of self, no self-acceptance, right? We're starting to see some of the stuff start to formulate. Devaluing herself as a person with no status. Like, if your mom doesn't like you, who in this world is supposed to, right?
Yeah.
She talked about how mom loved a sister, so there's an emotional inequality, right? A sense of devaluing her as a person and idealizing her sister, right? So there's the idealizing and the devaluing literally within the relationship that she perceives her mom to have with her and her sister. Described her mother in all negative terms: mean, aggressive, hurtful, abusive, not supportive, not safe, not loving. Stories of her mother constantly criticizing her, judging her, being mean to her, unforgiving, nasty. These are all the words that she used. So I always tell people people don't choose their words by accident. It's not like, oh, I just said something, especially in a therapeutic setting. They oftentimes are very specific.
Yeah, not like you're like angry and like you just said something maybe like highly emotional.
Right. She described being close to her father, but this is yet the way she described her dad to me. He's not a great man. He's a good guy, but he does bad things. And so, like, if mom is this nasty person, she perceives dad to be good, but dad does a lot of bad things. And so there's these weird rationalizations. And it was like, this was a source of conflict within our session. I was like, you describe dad as being good, but how can dad be good if he does a lot of bad things? I don't understand the connection there. I don't understand what you're actually trying to say. And she struggled to qualify it. She said that dad, grandfather, and great-grandfather were all abusive. So there is this traumatic and accepted history of abuse. There's a tradition in her life of anger, of aggression, of physical and emotional abuse that has occurred. It's been like generational, that has passed down. Dad assaulted this girl twice, right? But she brushes that off as like tough parenting almost, even though she identifies dad as this like good person who does bad things.
Yeah.
She kind of categorizes it as this bad thing. She talked about witnessing the domestic violence, and I quote, dad used to beat the hell out of mom in front of her, right? She had a self-report of being in multiple relationships that were both physically and emotionally abusive, at least 4 or more relationships that she had a pattern of seeking out individuals who would abuse her. She was sexually assaulted, and this was an interesting component. She was sexually assaulted later in her life, but she was drunk and intoxicated. And the friends that she was with left her. And so the person sexually assaulted her while she was left unprotected. And she used to talk about how she felt abandoned by her friends all the time. These people who were supposed to be there to support her and keep her safe left her alone. And so she was sexually assaulted. And so what we begin to see is when we look at this kind of history, and we look at the relationship instability, when we look at this person and we say expectations that is that the other person will be there in return to meet her needs, right? Who in her life has actually met her needs?
Doesn't sound like anybody.
Her, that's it. There's a devaluing of people in her life, right? We can see it start to play out with the relationship between how her mom pitted her against her sister, and how she perceived, at least, mom to love the sister more than she did her. So there's the idealization and the devaluing. She had oftentimes said that she has a self-image of her seeing herself as bad or good. And when she would talk about the relationships with her exes, like when they started, everything was wonderful. And she wanted to crush them later in life. And she talked about recognizing the own instability in her relationships between, why is it all the good guys that come into my life, like I'm so eager to get rid of them, but I stick around with these losers. So there's chronic feelings of emptiness. The physical abuse constitutes those self-destructive behaviors. She had difficulty controlling her emotions. She would talk about how she would get drunk, lash out, create these huge scenes, and then feel really guilty the next day and like long for that person's love and support and forgiveness back to them. Anger is often elicited when a lover was seen to be neglectful, withholding, or uncaring. So there's the rejection, right? And so what we talked about was when the rejection occurs, all these other behaviors usually follow behind it. So whenever she perceives somebody as wanting to break up with her or end the relationship, even though for like months she could be coming to me being like, I need to get out of this relationship. This sucks, this doesn't work. The second that dynamic would occur where he would eventually like take the step to initially maybe start ending the relationship, it was like she would turn around and like almost beg for the person to be back in her life. So this is the instability that exists. And imagine being this person and imagine being the people that are in their lives. Like there's no stability anywhere for anybody, including that my client. And like that's the part where if you can maintain your empathy, you can see that, because sometimes these people, and it was ironic because I didn't dislike this client. Actually, I was very fond of her. I still am. She was a really, really interesting human being and very, very successful and incredibly smart and articulate and funny and had done like a lot of things in her life. Like I told her, I'm like, you should definitely write like 4 books because your life is like this amazing story. But it's been capped, and the background of it has been all these relationship issues and the struggles that she's had. And it's ironic because sometimes with borderline personalities, you generally dislike them because they're just like, they'll attack you. They'll walk in.
Make you dislike them.
And then, they'll be like, our first session was really great, but our second one, fucking terrible, Rick. It sucked. I don't think you're a really good therapist. And, and so like it puts you in this defensive posture sometimes where they can attack you, and people struggle to take responsibility and accept certain truths about their life and about them. And so oftentimes it's reflected on you. And so then you want to become defensive. And so this is why a lot of therapists have transference, because they're like, God, I've seen this. They don't operate sometimes in the most rational places. And so it can be very difficult for healthy individuals to work with these people. Assuming, of course, that the therapist is a healthy individual. That's a large statement. I've known a few that aren't. Let's leave it at that.
But I can see how this would make it really challenging to not only be, just in this person's life and like, whether they're dating or family or friends, but especially being a therapist, trying to help, because it almost feels like, wait, you're trying to like work against me with like what you're saying. But I think sharing that really showcases, because I think anybody can listen to some of those symptoms and be like, oh, I do that. Like,
sure.
Am I borderline? But like, this is pretty clear. Like, this is a very dramatic, extreme, diagnosis. And it's not, of course, there's a spectrum, and there's going to be lesser degrees for some people, but.
And I like the fact that you're highlighting that, because I think sometimes what people will do is and this was something we all discovered in graduate school. I remember having this conversation with my diagnosis professor. I was like, if I look at a lot of these different diagnoses, at any point in my life, I could have qualified or had symptoms of some of these things. And he's like, absolutely right. He's like, but it doesn't mean that you are. He's like, depending on the circumstances, the environment, the place, the time in life, all these different factors, you can have these things and still not be them. But the idea of it is, and this is something that I've always tried to stress, right? I look at the way it's impacting the person in their life. And is this a situational thing where for 20 years I haven't had these issues, but now I'm finding it, like within the last like 2 or 3 years? Okay, well, maybe what's been happening in the last 2 or 3 years, that's more significant, because the last 20 years you were not experiencing any of these symptoms, versus a person who's like, pretty much my whole life. Like, ever since I was like a teenager and started dating, or my family, and like I haven't had great relationships with people, or my girlfriends, and you start to see a pervasive pattern developing like over and over again. It's like, okay, now we're dealing more with a personality disorder rather than somebody who might be struggling with more events in their life or things that are happening situationally for them.
Yeah.
No,
that makes a lot of sense. And I want that to be clear for people, because especially for like these topics, because it can be hard, especially when you're listening to stuff, or even when people just say like mental health, right? And they're talking and they'll be like, oh, this person's like negative mental health. And it's like, oh, don't say that. Like, you don't know what they're going through. And it's like, well, there is a very big difference between like, going through some stressful situations and like maybe being affected by those, versus a severe mental health diagnosis where it's been for most of their life, or 5, 10 plus years, and it's really affecting everyone around them.
Yeah.
It's just interesting, like, when you hear that word, like what it means, like it means different things to different people. And especially like, I would imagine like if you're like a researcher and like you're so used to, like researchers are so used to using certain terms and they know they're very well defined, but then out in the regular world, it kind of gets very dicey. When you say somebody has poor mental health, a researcher typically knows what that means. That's like a serious thing that they're talking about, not just like, oh, I've been really stressed out lately, so I'm a little anxious and depressed. Like, that's
absolutely
like the pop culture psychology that's always like.
And bipolar gets that a lot. But like one of my favorite terms that I have to check sometimes is because I work with criminals. A lot of times people will say, oh my God, that person's they have such an antisocial personality.
You're like, and
I'm like, I have to realize, I'm like, okay, they're talking about a person who just doesn't want to go out in public or like be around people. Not a psychopath, you know what I mean? Not somebody who like can harm individuals with no conscience.
Introverted.
So like when people say that, again, that's the modern day use that pop kind of culture says. We're like, oh, they're antisocial. That just means like they don't like social gatherings. Versus what it means in a clinical environment when somebody labels you an antisocial personality, like you got some problems. We're basically saying like you're a bad person in many ways.
Harm likely to society and yourself.
Other people, so
that's a funny one.
Yeah. Bipolar personality disorder, the other BPD.
Oh my God, that really is frustrating.
I know.
But this is a mood disorder.
So this is an instability that is kind of conceptualized by extreme highs and extreme lows. Now, again, if you're comparing this to borderline, right? We just talked about how it sounds like it's on extremes, right? But it's different. Is that this particular bipolar disorder, it does impact your life in negative ways. Versus the borderline personality, what we begin to see is that this is more, to me, more biological than it is a result of upbringing.
Okay.
I say that because there's not great research on the etiology or the origin of bipolar disorder. It's just kind of like a person can be happy one day, sad the next day with no triggering events. Whereas with borderlines, it was like, all right, at least we could identify the person leaving them as the triggering event or something that happened externally to say, all right, we know why this is a result. I mean, sometimes there's truly imbalances that are biological or inherited within the brain, and it's biological and it affects the nervous system. Like there's a dysregulation within the nervous system for these people, and so sometimes medication is necessary.
Is there really any medication that is useful for borderline?
Depending on for borderlines?
Yeah.
I guess if there's a lot of mood instability that goes with it or depressive symptoms that are going with it, then yeah, you can have some success with those drugs. But the reality of it is the way the person is perceiving the problem is based in thought.
Yeah.
And so it's changing the perception of how they're thinking about something and their perception of it and their role in it that is going to produce more longer term results.
Yeah, because whereas like antipsychotics are more obviously like for like the dopamine and like that where all this is like dysregulated, or like SSRIs, but like I just don't know, that doesn't really sound like it would help that. It might make it more maybe manageable, but it's not really helping. There's
medications for compulsive behaviors that have good success, which they can give that person to help with the impulsivity. So, that I would actually like step back from the conversation and yield more toward a psychiatrist to say, hey.
No, I'm just curious if there are standard.
There are various medications that can be prescribed to help those things depending on what the person is struggling with most.
Definitely bipolar. That's pretty obvious.
Yes, bipolar, yeah. So what I want people to understand about bipolar is where it is in relationship to previous diagnoses. Bipolar in the DSM is what we refer to now. In the past, it used to be called manic depressive. And so what I want people to think about this diagnosis is basically a teeter-totter. Is on one side we have mania, and the other side we have depression, and they kind of teeter back and forth. It doesn't have to occur in that exact pattern, but they are polar opposites of each other, hence bipolar. So when we're talking about it, what we need to understand is how do we conceptualize mania and how do we conceptualize major depression? Okay, so first and foremost, and we're also going to get into the differences between what is bipolar 1 versus bipolar 2, because there are subsets of this particular disorder. It means more to the therapist treating you than it does to you necessarily, but so number one, an inflated sense of self-esteem, grandiosity that comes with it. Oftentimes, this is for manic episodes. Sorry, I should qualify that. Yeah. So manic episodes oftentimes are going to be on that one extreme. So we're going to see a person who is got this entitled sense of like importance that comes with them. There's going to be a decreased need for sleep. Oftentimes they present as insomniacs. They have difficulty staying asleep. They have difficulty even wanting to go to sleep. They just feel like it's not even necessary.
That's such an interesting side effect of like manic episodes.
Yeah.
Like they just don't sleep for like a week. Literally. Well, and they're still functioning. Like they're still highly functioning.
I mean, like you might recognize something. Like what would that look like? Well, I was just kind of joking around with you before. It's like I've had clients where middle of the night though, wife will wake up, she'll walk out into the living room, it's 3 a.m, and like the husband's in there repainting the living room because he can't sleep. He's engaging in these like non-purposeful activities sometimes, and they're all over the place. They're more talkative and pressured than usual. Like there's a rapid speech pattern that comes with it. There's like this inability to just kind of sit in space and listen to a conversation. They're constantly talking. There's flight of ideas is very typical and common. This is like constant rapid changing of ideas. Like, oh my God, I was thinking about this thing to solve the current hunger crisis in Ethiopia, and then I was like, oh, I'll run for state senator over here today. And then I was like, oh, I was thinking that we could reorganize all the cabinets this way. And it's kind of like none of the ideas match, and they're very rapid and shifting. So there's just flight of ideas that occurs.
And they're extreme ideas. They're not just like, oh, I was thinking about a problem, and here's a few solutions that are maybe kind of scattered. Like this is, again, very specific.
Yeah. And this is also where some of that stuff can borderline on psychosis, because depending on what the person is saying, it can be perceived as them being delusional. And so you can have bipolar disorder with psychosis. And so it's really important. I'm going to get into a caveat for all of these things. There's an increase in goal-directed activity, right? So they might start businesses. They might take on new projects at work. They might be doing new things at school. It's kind of this non-goal-directed activity that is they're just putting their effort and their energy into all these different things. Very rarely will they complete any one project. They're just kind of like starting a bunch of different things because they're in a manic state. And then excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. That could be shopping sprees, sexual indiscretions, foolish business investments. You might see somebody be like, oh yeah, I heard about a stock and I'm just going to throw $10,000 or $50,000 or $2 million, or I'm going to bet the company's pension plan in this new thing that I've never heard of or invested, So a lot of times what they're going to do is create scenarios within themselves and within their environments that are going to be really detrimental. Number one, though, what I want you to understand is, especially with bipolar disorder, one of the biggest caveats in understanding these things is we have to know that it isn't being caused by some other related disorder, that it can't be medically induced or some psychological disorder that is also causing these symptoms, right? So, like, for example, thyroid issues can create manic episodes. Traumatic brain injury, various seizure disorders. These are things that can create manic-like symptoms.
Like hyperthyroid?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hypo.
You ever seen a person who's like got a hyperthyroid? They can't sit still. They're like insatiable. They're constantly burning energy. Like, and they don't have a need for sleep. Like, hey, that sounds pretty manic.
Yeah.
There are various medications that can cause manic episodes or manic-like symptoms. I had a friend of mine who was taking a corticosteroid for asthma. That was keeping him up at nights. He was basically an insomniac for a while, and he had more energy. Wasn't sure. None of the doctors were just prescribing it, and he had just kind of stumbled onto it himself.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of research that indicates that. So various medications, also drug-induced psychosis. Amphetamines. Like, if you want to see what manic episode looked like, go watch somebody who just ripped a couple rails of cocaine. Somebody who's snorting or smoking meth. Like, stimulants are going to create manic-like episodes. So what's really important in diagnosing these things is understanding the background and the history of the person and knowing that it's not medically being caused. Like, that the manic episodes aren't there as a result of some other medical disorder. Number two, that these manic episodes are not the result of another psychological disorder. And number three, that they're not being induced through drugs or illicit materials. Because there's like schizophrenic disorders can obviously manifest as in manic ways. So, these are all differential diagnoses that we start to roll through, but it's really important. So that's kind of the manic side. That's what mania is. So what's the depressive side, the major depressive episode? Major depressive episodes. Number one, being depressed, being sad, empty, hopelessness. That's
like
pretty
a
common.
major episode.
Major episodes would be consistent with 2 weeks or more.
Okay.
And we would want to have 5 or more of the following.
How long
symptoms.
is mania usually? I mean, that obviously can vary, but how long would that be?
This is what's going to get into differentiating between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2.
Oh,
so
sorry.
Manic episodes would traditionally last 7 consecutive days.
Okay.
So if you're experiencing those symptoms for 7 consecutive days, that is the criteria. And you only need 3 of them. That's the criteria for mania, right?
It's a lot of days, though.
It is a lot of days.
Yeah, that's not like, I had a crazy day or 2.
There's a thing called hypomanic, which is for bipolar 2, which is 4 consecutive days. Okay. But the major depressive episode criteria for both is the same. So that doesn't change. So it would be 5 or more symptoms of at least 2 weeks. Okay?
Rough. Okay.
It is. So being depressed, which is like sad, empty, hopelessness. Diminished interest in pleasurable activities, things that you find enjoyable, like you just kind of stop doing them, you withdraw from them, you don't participate in them. It's a symptom of it. Significant weight loss or significant weight gain, right? Everybody's got a different coping mechanism. Some people, obviously, when they're depressed, they withdraw from food. Other people, when they're depressed, they eat a lot. Again, we're going to see disturbances in sleep patterns, either insomnia or hypersomnia, right? Which refers to excessive amounts of daytime sleeping. So we can go from the person who's not sleeping enough to the person who's sleeping way too much. We can see kind of psychomotor agitation, which is a fancy way of saying they're unable to sit still, they're very restless, they can have a stiff body, they can be unable to relieve tension, find it difficult to find a comfortable position to sit in, they can be very exacerbated, irritable, tearful. That's kind of what all falls into that category. Fatigue, loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, inappropriate amounts of guilt. We'll see a diminished ability to think concretely. We'll see recurring thoughts of suicide or death. I don't mean kind of a fear of death. I mean people are like constantly thinking about dying. They're planning on killing themselves or hurting themselves, talking about all the time how worthless life is and I don't want to live. Those are definitely suicidal features, but that's essentially what a major depressive episode looks like. Okay, it's 2 weeks of 5 or more of those symptoms. Now, what is bipolar 1 and what is bipolar 2? So now that we know what manic is and what we know what major depressive episodes are, bipolar 1 is, what's most important to understand about bipolar 1 is that it is just pretty much the only mandate for it is that you have one manic episode one time in your entire life. Okay? It is very rare. We've all been on benders and we've all done crazy things and we've all been kids and whatever.
But yeah, 7
To
days.
still be up for 7 days is not typical. And again, assuming that it's not drug induced, assuming that it's not another medical related disorder, that's what
and it's
a
coming
manic episode
seemingly
is.
out of nowhere.
Virtually, yeah. Versus, so bipolar 1 is literally the presence of a manic episode. You do not need, it is not necessary for a major depressive episode to have existed in order for a diagnosis of bipolar 1. It's more than likely, though, it will accompany one. It just doesn't, it's not necessary, okay? For bipolar 2, what we're talking about now is hypomania and a major depressive episode. So what is hypomania? It's all the same symptoms of mania, just for a period of 4 or more days, okay? So if it's like around that 3 to 4 day mark and you've been experiencing those things, but around day 5, you like start to come down, it's more of a hypomanic state rather than a manic state. But with bipolar 2, you also need the diagnosis or the criteria of a major depressive episode.
I feel like they probably, for most people, would go hand in hand, right?
Most people
because
would.
of that peak, you're gonna go
Yeah.
below baseline.
I mean, like I heard one guy describe it, and it was the best analogy that I've heard. He described being bipolar as like being a Ferrari. He's like, imagine being a Ferrari and you just floor it, and you're driving, it's like totally redlined, and you're driving down a winding road. And then all of a sudden, sooner or later, what's going to happen to that Ferrari? Like the engine's going to blow, or you're going to crash and spin out of control. So then the direct opposite is going to occur, right? However, it isn't necessary that it follows that pattern. It's not like an extreme
One
high
happens.
followed by an extreme low. It can be, I have an extreme high, return back to normal. Then I have another extreme high, return back to normal, and another extreme high and return back to normal. They may not have the depressive symptoms that go with it. Most people will, though. There's generally a period where they can go like high, high, low, high, high, low, low, high. You know what I mean? It's just whatever their pattern is. But I think sometimes people will miss that because they're like, oh, he had the manic episode. We're waiting for the depressive episode that doesn't necessarily come.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what they are.
Yeah, that does make more sense though with the idea behind it being biologically driven versus anything else, like in your life happening.
Mm-hmm.
Because if there is no pattern that way, just makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, but from my experience, and again, I don't have the breadth and depth of working with bipolar as much as I do some of the other personality disorders, but in my experience, most of them have had the major depression that comes with it. And again, this type of disorder takes a toll on the family around you. They see you suffering, and so as a result, what happens when there's like, if I were to light a fire in your house, where would all of your attention and effort go? If I lit a fire in the kitchen, where would your effort and attention go?
Right there.
Right there. So what does that mean? It means every other room in the house is being neglected. And so what I want you to think about is this person is like a constant walking fire, where other people in the house can't exist. We can't celebrate little Timmy's accomplishments or Jane's birthday party because John is going to suck everybody's attention up because John's depressed. Or John's manic and now everybody's super happy, or people are like, what the hell is going on with John? Like, no one else has any room to exist in the relationship. We don't get to be special. We don't get our moments. We don't get validated or acknowledged. And in fact, everybody else in the relationship ends up making sacrifices for this person. So then there can be this deep level of resentment because the parents are almost in a sense neglecting you because they have to deal with the fire, right? How are you going to build any other part of your house if the kitchen's on fire?
Yeah, that's so tough.
You're not. And so it becomes a really difficult space. And this is where the people who have the disorder sometimes aren't the ones getting the treatment. It's the family members around them that are getting the treatment. And what you see is as childhood friendships evolve, they create a lot of distance. They're no longer friends. They don't maintain good relationships anymore. People don't want to be around them. There's a strong separation and a pushback because they're like, I just need to create space and distance from this person.
Which is probably not helping.
No.
Episodes.
So, two things that I did want to talk about because they're commonly misunderstood as we were talking about, like kind of pop psychology. Rapid cycling, and this is what I hear a lot. Like it's always funny to me because somebody will call me up and be like, "Oh, my mom is so bipolar," and I'll be like, "Tell me why." And then they'll be like, "Oh, well, I was talking to my mom, and 1 minute she's fine, and then the next minute she's like all pissed off and angry." That's not bipolar, okay? She has to be manic for like an extended period of time. Like
7 days.
Upbeat, like all those other things have to be existing. And so a lot of times what I hear is it's common for people to misuse the term bipolar because what they're referring to is a mood swing. A person being happy 1 second and literally being upset the next minute. So
it's just like emotional dysregulation.
Yeah, so what that means is, so rapid cycling in terms of bipolar actually means having 4 or more of these episodes within a 12-month period. Now, it doesn't need to be like manic, depressive, manic, depressive. It could be manic, 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 manic.
Or depressive.
Within 12 months, you would be considered to have rapid cycling.
But then what yes. Okay.
That makes sense, though? Okay. And for bipolar 2, again, it's just the manic episodes, but on 4 days versus the 7-day. But again, the major depressive criteria is going to be the same for either or. And so there's
not just like a manic diagnosis.
No.
Okay.
It would be bipolar 1.
Okay.
If you were just manic. Then there's another one called cyclothymic disorder. Cyclothymic disorder basically means that you have experienced hypomanic symptoms and depressive periods without ever fully meeting criteria for either one. So if that doesn't confuse it a little bit more, it basically means like if we were looking at it like this, we have a manic state, which is 7 days. We have a hypomanic state, which is 4 days. But if I've been manic for 2 or 3 days, I don't necessarily fit the criteria for hypomania or mania. So what am I? You're more in that cyclothymic period where it's like I didn't quite fit the criteria, but it's still a pervasive enough pattern and it's existed long enough to where this is existing. So if like we were to like have a chart, right, where here's hypo and here's mania, you're like coming underneath it. You're not quite reaching it, but it is pervasive enough to where we can diagnose it as more of a cyclothymic disorder where it's like you're experiencing these mood irregulations without necessarily being bipolar 1 or bipolar 2. And that's kind of an overview of what it is. So when somebody says bipolar, just think of it as a teeter-totter between crazy energy and feeling happy, which is that manic, versus the depressive episode, which is the teetering side of that. And then, depending on how high you want to go, can be the hypomanic and the manic state. And the major depression kind of stays the same. But what's most important about understanding these things is the effect that it takes on everybody, including that person.
Yeah, I was like, and not even just the people in their lives, but them. This sounds really debilitating.
It is.
I mean, the length of time that you're talking about is not like hey, I had a rough weekend, or oh, things have been really stressful. Like, this is a very continuous and pervasive. Like, even if you had this a few times a year, that would really knock somebody out. Like, as far as like, I mean, I guess you can be productive when you're manic, but like, are you really productive, or are you just like starting a bunch of stuff, right? Like, and yeah, this is definitely very debilitating. And, hopefully these people do end up going in for treatment, right? Because like you said, a lot of times you see the periphery people who are affected, but this is definitely something that can't really go untreated. I feel like this would probably get worse. I don't know. That's just a hypothesis, but I would imagine if this left untreated and then people in their lives eventually like push them away because they're just like, we can't handle this.
Yes.
I really can't imagine this getting much better for that person. Like, I don't think they could probably hold down a relationship or a job or any type of stable anything without
meds.
Yeah.
And there's obviously various different, psychiatrists and physicians out there that have different philosophies on when you should use medications, when you shouldn't use medications. So there's some people who don't believe in them at all, and they're like, we can address these things by doing various other things. And so I would always suggest people find people who specialize in these particular things. If you're struggling with borderline, or somebody who is, find somebody who is highly trained in DBT. If you're struggling with bipolar disorder, like, find somebody who specializes in treatment of that particular disorder, who understands its complexity and the nature of it, who can give you the right medications. And most importantly, for these types of disorders, they're definitely more complicated. And so what I rely on is a support system. Like, if I'm going to be treating somebody who I know is bipolar from a therapeutic perspective, I'll ask them to give me signed consents and releases so that I can speak with their psychiatrist, so that the psychiatrist and I can be in alignment to say, like, look, this person's presenting this way, they're saying these things, are they bringing this to you, etc., so that we have kind of this uniform approach where it's going to produce the best outcome for the client. And same thing with borderlines. Like, it's important sometimes, especially in the treatment center that I work, for us to have these kind of like weekly, daily clinical meetings where we kind of run over different clients and talk about them, because we're not with them all day, but other people interact with them in different environments and settings. And so you need to see this holistic thing, and to be able to bounce ideas off of each other and rely on the psychiatrist and the medical staff and the therapists and the other therapists to be like, this is creating a much broader picture of this individual with a lot of detail. It's necessary to help us identify whether it's our own shit we're pushing onto this client, or whether or not they're traditional, what they're really manifesting and what's happening with them. So it's difficult, it's complicated, it's not an overnight solution. If you or anybody that you guys know are struggling with these things, please reach out for help. You don't have to be alone and suffer through this. It's just as debilitating for them as it is for you, but I know that that's hard when you're living with the person, to feel sorry for them, especially when they've gotten like every ounce of energy and effort from everybody and you've gotten nothing. That's the heartbreaking part of it.
For sure. And we just thought this would be interesting to go over because there's, there are a lot of people affected by this, and I just feel like these two are certainly not talked about as much. But I think this was a really good overview, and at least provided some more context, which I think is really necessary, instead of just being like, oh, somebody has mood swings, they must be bipolar. It's like, that's a little more complex.
Slightly more complicated,
just a little, but So as always, thank you guys so much for listening. If you do want to reach out to Rick, I'll put his contact information below. And if you have any other questions for us or would like to apply for coaching, you can visit teamlocofit.com. So thank you guys, and we'll talk to you next week.